My name is Laurel Whitlock, and last Thanksgiving my mother introduced me to her country club friends as the one who works for the government, something with paperwork. While 3 days earlier, I'd sat across from the Attorney General discussing the restructuring of our entire counterterrorism division. The irony would have been funny if it weren't so exhausting. I was 42 years old, and I'd spent the last 17 years building a career that most people would never fully understand, even if I could tell them about it, which I couldn't, not really. My official title was Senior Supervisory Special Agent, but that barely scratched the surface of what I actually did. I ran operations. I made decisions that affected national security. I had a security clearance so high that even mentioning its level was classified. But to my family, I was just Laurel. Vague job Laurel. Does something with the government Laurel, the disappointment. It hadn't always been this way. When I'd first joined the FBI at 25, fresh out of my master's program in criminology, my parents had been cautiously proud. FBI agent sounded impressive at dinner parties. It had cash. But as the years passed, and I couldn't talk about my work, couldn't bring them to my office, couldn't explain why I sometimes disappeared for weeks at a time, their pride had curdled into something else. Embarrassment. My older brother Preston was a cardiovascular surgeon. He had plaques on his wall, articles written about him, patients who sent him thank you cards that my mother photocopied and mailed to relatives. My younger sister Anissa was a corporate attorney at a white shoe firm in Manhattan. She wore Louboutins and carried a Birkin and made partner at 33. And then there was me, wearing off-the-rack suits and driving a government vehicle and living in a modest townhouse in Arlington that I barely saw because I was always at the office or on a plane or in a secure facility somewhere that I couldn't name. Laurel's very dedicated, my mother would say at family gatherings in the same tone one might use to describe a particularly earnest volunteer at an animal shelter. She works so hard. We just wish she'd chosen something more lucrative. The thing that killed me, really killed me, was that they genuinely believed they were being supportive. 3 weeks ago, I'd been standing in my parents' kitchen in Greenwich, Connecticut, helping my mother prepare for one of her elaborate Sunday dinners. She'd invited the Harringtons, a wealthy couple from her tennis club, along with their son who was very successful in private equity. "He's single," my mother had said, arranging orchids in a crystal vase. "Very handsome. Preston says he's brilliant." "Mom, I'm not interested in being set up." "Laurel, you're 42. You need to think about your future. This job of yours." She'd waved her hand dismissively. "It's not giving you anything. No husband, no financial security. When are you going to get serious about your life?" I'd been holding a wine glass at the time. I'd set it down carefully before I could throw it. "I am serious about my life. You know what I mean. Preston has the house in Westchester, the place in the Hamptons. Anissa just bought that gorgeous apartment overlooking Central Park. And you're still renting. I own my townhouse. That little place in Virginia?" My mother had made a face like she'd tasted something sour. "Darling, that's not a real investment. That's just existing." I'd learned over the years not to argue. What was the point? I couldn't tell her that I owned my townhouse outright because I'd been given a retention bonus of $200,000 3 years ago to keep me from being recruited away by another agency. I couldn't tell her that I had investment accounts that would make her head spin. I couldn't tell her that I'd turned down 2 private sector jobs that would have tripled my salary because the work I did mattered more than money. So I just smiled and said, "You're right, Mom. I should really think about my future." She'd patted my hand, satisfied that her wisdom had landed. The dinner with the Harringtons had been predictably awful. The son, Garrett, had talked about his portfolio for 45 minutes straight. When he'd finally asked what I did, I'd given my standard vague answer. "I work for the FBI." "Oh, like CSI?" he'd asked, grinning. "Do you dust for fingerprints?" Something like that. Quote, Preston had jumped in, eager to move past my boring career. Garrett was just telling us about his new place in Aspen. Ski in, ski out, sounds incredible. The conversation had rolled on without me, and I'd sat there eating my mother's overcooked beef tenderloin and wondering how much longer I had to stay to fulfill my familial obligations. This pattern had repeated itself in various forms for years. Every holiday, Every family gathering, every Sunday dinner, was a subtle reminder that I'd somehow failed to launch properly. That my life was small and unremarkable and faintly embarrassing. 2 weeks ago, things had escalated. Preston had called me on a Tuesday evening, excited in a way I hadn't heard since he'd been accepted into medical school. "Laurel, I need to tell you about something incredible." "Okay. I've started working with this life coach, Dr. Nathaniel Evans. Have you heard of him?" I'd heard of him extensively, actually, because Dr. Nathaniel Evans was one of my informants. Not that Preston needed to know that. "Doesn't ring a bell," I'd said carefully. "He's absolutely brilliant. He only works with high-level executives, CEOs, celebrities. I had to be on a waiting list for 6 months. His fee is $5,000 per session." I'd nearly choked on my coffee. Evans was charging $5,000 per session? I'd have to have a conversation with him about that. Our agreement was that he'd maintain his practice's cover, but I hadn't realized he'd gotten quite so entrepreneurial about it. "That's a lot of money," I'd said. "It's an investment in myself. He teaches you how to project power, how to command a room. These are subtleties that most people don't understand. You, lass, wouldn't understand such subtleties of the world." There it was, the casual condescension wrapped in brotherly concern. "You're probably right," I'd said, my voice flat. "I'm not trying to be mean, Laurel. I just think you could benefit from thinking bigger. Your job, it's fine, it's steady, but you're never going to be more than middle class doing what you're doing. There's no shame in that, but you should be realistic about your limitations." I'd ended the call shortly after that, citing a work emergency. Which wasn't a lie. I always had work emergencies. But mostly, I just needed to get off the phone before I said something I'd regret. The thing about Dr. Nathaniel Evans was that he was a complicated asset. 3 years ago, he'd been peripherally involved in a financial fraud case we were investigating. He wasn't a target, just someone who'd trained several of the main players. But during our initial interview, he'd been so desperate to avoid any association with the scandal that he'd offered to help us. "I know these people," he'd said. "I know how they think, how they operate. I can be useful to you." And he had been. Evans moved in circles I couldn't easily access. Wealthy executives, tech entrepreneurs, the kind of people who committed white-collar crimes behind closed doors and NDAs. He'd fed me information that had led to 4 major arrests and the recovery of $80 million in stolen assets. In exchange, I protected his reputation. I kept his name out of court documents. I let him maintain his lucrative practice as a high-end life coach, which gave him credibility with exactly the kind of clients who might, eventually, become investigative targets. It was a good arrangement, but I'd made him agree to a few rules. One of them was no new clients without my approval. I needed to vet anyone he was working with to avoid conflicts of interest or compromised investigations. Preston apparently hadn't required my approval. I'd sent Evans a text that night, "We need to talk." His response had been immediate. "I know, I'm sorry, he sought me out." I didn't realize the connection until the second session. We'd met for coffee the next morning at a generic chain in Bethesda, the kind of place where no one paid attention to anyone else's conversations. "Your brother is not a target of any investigation," Evans had said quickly. I checked. "That's not the point. The point is, you took him on without telling me." "I know. I apologize. But Laurel, he's paying me $5,000 a session. That's $20,000 a month." I couldn't exactly turn him away without raising suspicions. I'd rubbed my temples. $5,000? Nathaniel? That's insane. "That's the market rate for what I do. You're a psychology PhD who spent 2 years in federal prison for insider trading before we gave you a second chance. Which is exactly why I understand the criminal mind so well. That's my value proposition." I'd wanted to argue, but he wasn't wrong. Evans was useful precisely because he understood how wealthy people justified their bad behavior. He spoke their language. "Fine," I'd said. "Keep Preston as a client. But you report to me weekly about any contacts he mentions, any business opportunities, anything that might be relevant. And if he starts talking about anything illegal, you shut it down and call me immediately." Of course. And Nathaniel, my family doesn't know what I do. They think I'm just a regular agent. It needs to stay that way. He'd smiled, understanding. "Your secret is safe with me." That had been 10 days ago. Since then, I'd been dealing with an escalating crisis involving a domestic terrorism cell in Michigan, a compromised agent in Seattle, and a bureaucratic nightmare with the Department of Justice over surveillance warrants. I'd slept maybe 20 hours in the last week. I'd eaten more vending machine food than any human should consume. I was running on coffee and spite. And then my mother had called. "Laurel, darling, I'm having a dinner party on Friday night, just family and a few close friends. I expect you there." "Mom, I'm in the middle of something at work." "It's always work with you. Preston is bringing his new life coach. Apparently he's quite famous. It'll be a wonderful evening." I'd closed my eyes. Of course Preston was bringing Evans. Of course he wanted to show off his expensive guru to the family. "I'll try to make it. Laurel, this is important. Family is important. You can't keep using work as an excuse to avoid your life." And there it was again. The implication that my work wasn't real life. That the things I did, the decisions I made, the operations I ran, none of it mattered as much as showing up to my mother's dinner parties. "I'll be there," I'd said. Friday arrived faster than I wanted it to. The Michigan situation had stabilized, barely, and I'd managed to delegate the Seattle crisis to a trusted colleague. I'd even gone home to shower and change into civilian clothes. Dark jeans, a silk blouse, a blazer that hid my service weapon. I always carried my weapon. Even to family dinners. Especially to family dinners, actually, because those were the situations where I was most likely to want to shoot someone. My parents' house in Greenwich was a sprawling colonial that my father had bought 20 years ago when his hedge fund had a particularly good year. It sat on 2 acres of carefully manicured lawn with a circular driveway and a fountain that my mother had insisted on installing despite my father's concerns about ostentation. Preston's Tesla was already in the driveway when I arrived, along with Anissa's Mercedes and several cars I didn't recognize. I parked my government-issued Ford Fusion next to a Bentley and tried not to think about how perfectly that encapsulated my family dynamic. Inside, the house smelled like my mother's signature diptyque candles and something expensive being cooked in the kitchen. I could hear voices from the living room, the high, bright chatter of people performing social success at each other. "Laurel!" My mother appeared in the foyer, resplendent in Chanel and diamonds. "You made it, and you're only," she checked her watch, 40 minutes late." "Traffic?" I lied. "Of course. Well, come in, everyone's here. Preston's friend Dr. Evans is absolutely charming, so sophisticated." She led me into the living room, where about 15 people were standing around with drinks, arranged in the careful clusters of established social hierarchy. Preston and Anissa were holding court near the fireplace, surrounded by my parents' wealthiest friends. Preston's wife, Casey, was wearing what looked like $30,000 worth of jewelry. Anissa's fiancé, Brett, was describing his latest sailing trip. And standing next to Preston, laughing at something my father had said, was Dr. Nathaniel Evans. He was exactly as I remembered him, mid-50s, silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of practiced warmth that comes from years of manipulating people for a living. When he saw me, his eyes widened almost imperceptibly, a flash of recognition, quickly controlled. "Laurel," Preston called out, "come meet Dr. Evans. Nathaniel, this is my sister I was telling you about." Quote. Evans extended his hand, his face arranged in polite interest. "A pleasure to meet you, Ms. Whitlock." I shook his hand. "Likewise." "Preston tells me you work for the FBI," Evans said smoothly. "That must be fascinating work." "It has its moments." "Laurel's being modest," my mother interjected, "though I'm not entirely sure what she does. Something with paperwork, I think. Very bureaucratic." There were polite laughs from the assembled guests, the kind of laughter that said, "Thank goodness we don't have boring jobs like that." "Actually, Mom, The important thing is that she's employed, my father said jovially. Not all of our children can be high achievers, right? Someone has to be the steady, reliable one. More laughter. I felt my jaw tighten. Preston jumped in, eager to redirect attention to his guru. Dr. Evans has been absolutely transformative for me. He's teaching me about executive presence, about how to command respect in any situation. It's all about projection, making people understand your value before you even speak. That's wonderful, dear, my mother said. I was just telling Bitsy Henderson about him. She's on the board at the hospital, you know. She might be able to send some clients your way. I appreciate that, Evans said. Though my practice is quite full at the moment, I'm very selective about who I work with. Of course you are, Anessa said. Preston waited 6 months to get a session with you. Well worth the wait, Preston said. Nathaniel is teaching me things I never learned in medical school. How to present yourself, how to negotiate, how to make people take you seriously. These are skills that separate the truly successful from the merely competent. He looked at me when he said, merely competent. It wasn't subtle. Interesting, I said. And what's your background, Dr. Evans? What qualifies you to teach these skills? I knew exactly what his background was, of course, but I was curious to see what story he was telling my brother. I have a PhD in organizational psychology, Evans said smoothly. I spent 15 years working with Fortune 500 executives before starting my coaching practice. I've worked with CEOs, politicians, celebrities, people who operate at the highest levels of their fields. All true. He'd left out the part about the insider trading and the federal prison sentence, but I suppose that wasn't first dinner party conversation. How impressive, I said dryly. Laurel's skeptical of everything, Preston said, laughing. It's the government worker mentality, no vision, no ambition. I wouldn't say that, I replied, keeping my voice light. I just think it's interesting that people pay thousands of dollars to learn how to, what? Stand up straight and make eye contact? Seems like common sense. That's exactly what someone without power would think, Preston said. You don't understand because you've never operated at that level. No offense, sis, but your world is very small. Forms and procedures and bureaucracy. The world Nathaniel and I operate in, it's about influence, about shaping reality through force of will. I took a long sip of my wine. Shaping reality, right. You should book a session with him, Anissa suggested. It might help you with your career. Maybe you could finally get a promotion or something. I'm actually doing fine, I said. Are you, though? My mother asked gently. Darling, you're 42 and you're still... I don't know how to say this kindly. You're still so middle tier. Don't you want more? I looked around the room at all these people, these successful, wealthy, accomplished people, all looking at me with varying degrees of pity. I'm exactly where I want to be, I said. My father patted my shoulder. That's a very healthy attitude. Not everyone can be a superstar. The world needs worker bees too. I excused myself to go to the bathroom. I needed a minute to breathe, to remind myself that this was temporary, that I'd be back in my real life soon, that these people's opinions didn't actually matter. I was washing my hands when Anissa came in. You okay? She asked. Fine. Look, I know they can be a lot, but they just want you to be happy. I am happy. Are you? Because from where I'm standing, you look kind of stuck. You've been doing the same job for almost 20 years. You live alone. You don't date. You don't have any hobbies we know of. Your whole life is just work, and not even interesting work. It's just sad. Quote, I turned to face her. My work is important. I'm sure it feels important to you, but Laurel, you have to think about the big picture. What are you building? What's your legacy? Preston has his practice, I have my partnership track, we're both establishing ourselves as serious professionals. You're just maintaining. Maybe maintaining is enough. She sighed. That's exactly the problem. You've accepted mediocrity, you've given up. I wanted to tell her that I'd been in a meeting with the Director of National Intelligence last month, that I'd been briefed by the President's security advisor. that the maintaining I did kept people safe, prevented terrorist attacks, dismantled criminal enterprises. But I couldn't. So I just said I should get back to the party. Dinner was a continuation of the same theme. Preston talked about his house renovation. Anissa talked about her upcoming wedding at a vineyard in Napa. My parents, friends talked about their various vacations and investments and philanthropic ventures. I ate my salmon and tried to remember why family was supposed to be important. And then, halfway through dessert, my phone rang. I'd set it to silent, but I'd programmed certain numbers to override the setting. When the director's office calls, you answer. I pulled out my phone. Everyone at the table looked at me with varying degrees of disapproval. Taking a phone call during dinner was, in my mother's world, the height of rudeness. "I'm sorry, I need to take this," I said. "Laurel, really," my mother said. "Can't it wait?" "No, it can't," I answered as I stood up from the table. "Yes, Dr. Evans." There was a moment of confused silence. Several people looked at Nathaniel Evans, who was sitting 3 seats away from me, very clearly not on the phone. "No, I'm still at dinner," I continued, walking toward the window for better reception. "Yes, your weekly report is still on for tomorrow. And please remember our agreement not to take on new clients without my approval, such as my brother, for example." The room had gone completely silent. I listened to Evans on the other end of the line, the real Evans, calling from his car, panicking because he'd just seen a news alert about one of his other clients being arrested, and he was worried about exposure. "We'll discuss it tomorrow," I said calmly. 10 o'clock at the usual place, and Nathaniel, next time, follow the protocol we established, no surprises. I ended the call and turned back to the table. Preston's face had gone through several shades of red and was settling on a kind of grayish white. My mother's mouth was open. Anissa had stopped with her fork halfway to her mouth. My father's expression was unreadable. Dr. Nathaniel Evans, the one sitting at the table, looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "I'm sorry," Preston said slowly. Did you just call Dr. Evans? On the phone, while he's sitting right here?" "Different Dr. Evans," I said mildly. "There's another Dr. Evans?" "There is." "And he reports to you?" "Yes." "Why would a life coach report to you?" I set my phone down on the table. "He's not a life coach. Well, he is, but that's not his primary function. He's a confidential informant. I've been running him for the last 3 years as part of my work with the FBI's white-collar crime division." Preston made a sound like all the air had been punched out of his lungs. "I'm sorry," Anissa said. "Your work with what?" "White-collar crime? Financial fraud, corporate espionage, money laundering, that sort of thing. Dr. Evans, your Dr. Evans, helps us identify potential targets. People with more money than ethics. It's been very productive." My mother had found her voice. "Preston has been seeing a criminal informant?" "Technically, he's not a criminal anymore. He served his time for insider trading back in 2019. Now he's a rehabilitated member of society who occasionally helps the federal government in exchange for certain considerations." "Insider trading?" Preston whispered. "He went to prison?" "Just for 2 years. He got out early for good behavior, and for agreeing to work with us." The man sitting next to Evans, one of my father's golf buddies, had started laughing, not a kind laugh. The kind of laugh that happens when someone else's humiliation is simply too delicious to contain. "So let me get this straight," Anissa said, her lawyer voice clicking into place. "Preston has been paying $5,000 a session to a federal informant who reports to our sister?" "That's correct. Though I'm going to have a conversation with him about that fee structure. Seems excessive." "You're running him," Preston said, still in that shocked whisper. "You're his handler. I prefer the term controlling agent, but yes." "So when you said you work for the FBI, you meant—" "I meant I'm a senior supervisory special agent in the Criminal Investigative Division. I run a team that handles complex white-collar cases, has been for about 8 years now. Before that, I was in counterintelligence." My father cleared his throat. "Laurel, why didn't you tell us this?" "Because I couldn't. Most of my work is classified or sensitive. I can't talk about ongoing investigations." "I can't bring you to my office." I can't explain where I am or what I'm doing most of the time. It's easier to just let you think I'm a bureaucrat. But you let us mock you, my mother said. You let us think you were. Mediocre? I supplied. Yes, I did. The table had gone silent again. This was a different kind of silence than before. This was the silence of a worldview cracking apart. Preston's fork slipped from his hand and clattered